Hello, everybody, and welcome to Nick at Night. I am Mamie Parker, and I am energized. I am excited and ready to hear from two professors from the Nicholas School of the Environment, and they're going to be talking to us about environmental rollbacks and climate change. And I am speaking on behalf, a welcome on behalf of my fellow board members. We have Dory Key here as well as Jim Tuchel. And it's amazing because Jim called Dorian and me to lunch, and we sat down, and he was so excited about an opportunity because he's so proud of being a graduate of Duke and all the great things that are going on there. And Dory added her enthusiasm along the way, and we were able to work with Kevin and others on the staff to come up with this great program for you tonight. It's really exciting to me being a fish and wildlife biologist in the former head of fisheries in this country, having worked on highway projects, Section 10404 permits, National Environmental Policy Act over the years in Wisconsin and Minnesota and Missouri and Massachusetts. So to be here tonight to hear from folks that's going to talk to us about the environment and what's going on there is very exciting to me, and I hope you enjoy it too. Our purpose here tonight is to certainly give you the opportunity to connect to some of the current research that's going on at the Nicholas School of the Environment. Also, we want you to relax and see this as somewhat informal because it's going to be interactive. We want you to be able to ask questions if you have questions. We want you to, really think about what this means. But at the end of the day, anytime we talk, anything we do, we try to make sure we encourage you to call you to action. And this is something I learned in a small Methodist church in Southern Arkansas. When my mother said, when all is said and done, sometimes more is said than done. So we want to make sure that you are encouraged from these presentations tonight to see what role you can play in this. And so I will pass it on now to my fellow board members so they can go over the process with you and give you an idea of how we're going to look at our questions tonight. Our two speakers will speak first briefly to give you an overview of the subject matter so you'll have some things to think about. And then we'll move on to questions and answers. And so Jim, or Dory, whichever one of you are ready to give them some instructions on the questions and the steps in the process.
Sure. Thanks, Mamie, and hi, everyone. Welcome. We have almost an hour set aside in the agenda tonight for question and answer and discussion. So we're really looking forward to everyone's participation, asking good questions and engaging dialogue. You can ask questions by typing them into the chat function, and we'll process through them and read them out. Or if you want to speak live, raise your hand. There's the reaction buttons. You can use the clapping hands or whatever, and we'll call on you and put you online and you can ask your question directly. When you're done speaking, please mute your line again so we can have good audio for the rest of the team. And that, I think, is pretty much a standard way we do Q&A on these Zoom calls. So with that, Mamie, back to you.
Thank you so much, Jim. Again, and thank you for inspiring us to invite our friends. And I do see some friends on the line, and I also see that we have about 22 participants. So we have a nice gathering tonight. So we'll get started. And first, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. And when I read her resume, but also had a chance to interact with her just now, dreaming, daring, and doing great things. And that's what we see with this award-winning professor, Megan Mullin. She is a scholar of American political and behaviors. She's really interested in her research is really centered on how political and social processes contribute to environmental outcomes. She's done some great research. One in particular that I think is interested is on decentralized governance, water management, as well as climate change politics. She's been featured in Nature magazine, as well as American Journal of Political Science, among others. She's also, as I said earlier, been an author, an award-winning professor. She is author of Governing the Taps, special district governance and the new local politics of water. Uh, she has a dual appointment, and not only does she spend her time in the Nicholas School of the Environment, but she's also has a secondary appointment at the Department of Political Science. So if you'll join me in welcoming Megan Mullin to the screen. Hi, Megan.
Hi, Mamie. Thank you for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight, and I have in mind a pretty informal set of comments to just start the conversation before passing it off to Drew, and then really looking forward to Q&A with all of you. And my comments are organized really around kind of a big picture take on where we are in climate policy now, why we're here, and I'm a political scientist, so I take a politics take on why we are here, and I'll give you a little hint of that, and again, happy to answer more questions afterwards. And then, you know, what is the future, right? What do things look like going forward from here? And, you know, my focus, I'm a student of American politics. And so my focus is really on US politics. And that's in keeping, right, with this theme. And I know that the session was organized around environmental rollbacks, right, contemporary environmental rollbacks. But I'm going to sort of talk in a little bit of a longer time horizon to set the stage for some of the recent policy activity. So where are we in climate policy? Most of you are familiar with this, with the state of things, right? With the status quo. We have no comprehensive federal law to control greenhouse gas emissions. We have limits on mobile sources, you know, transportation mostly, and mostly surface transportation, cars and trucks. Those limits have been weakened under the current administration. We have had a series of actions to address greenhouse gas emissions from stationary sources, primarily power generators. And those actions have been, in the last, you know, decade, have been through executive authority from the president's office. And they're competing, right? We had big actions from the Obama administration, and then counter actions from the Trump administration. And all of these are currently on contested legal ground. We have US really non-cooperation, I would say, with the international community currently. And even if that changes, we have now questions about the credibility of US commitments as we enter back into that international stage of climate negotiations. We have a lot of activity at the state and local levels, and we can't discount that activity. Some of that policy activity is really meaningful. There are 10 states or so, plus District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, that have legislation or other actions in place to implement 100% clean electricity policies. And the estimates are that those policies would produce significant emissions reductions if they're implemented. But it's also important to note that a lot of state policies that have been enacted in the past have subsequently been weakened, often substantially weakened, that state and local activity can only go so far, and that there are really important environmental justice issues with a decentralized approach where we may get substantial emission reductions and substantial changes, especially in electricity generation in some areas, but not in others. And for overall greenhouse gas emissions, that's important. Reductions are reductions, but for all the co-benefits of a transition, a clean energy transition, there are really important equity and justice issues related to that. So that's sort of the big picture of where we are. And so then, you know, a lot of my interest is about why are we here? And, you know, the simple story I would tell about kind of the history of US climate policy making relates to how distributive politics intersects with the form of our US political institutions. And so when I say distributive politics, I'm talking about sort of who gets what from policy activity, right? How do the benefits and the costs of policy activity get distributed geographically across sectors, across different kinds of actors in a political system? And so climate policy creates economic winners and losers. And winning is uncertain, right? So if there's a major policy change, that major policy change will give benefits to some actors in the political space, but they can't count on those benefits, right? The form of those benefits, the magnitude of those benefits, the consequences of those benefits are always uncertain. And those who would benefit may not be politically organized to demand those benefits, right? Because if, again, in the climate policy space, if we don't have a politically organized, right, renewables sector, then they're not going to be politically powerful to make demands. And that's been part of kind of the history of climate politics. The losing is much more certain, right? Losing in politics is feels more certain to those who are going to lose, and those who are going to lose tend to be organized, right? Because they've been beneficiaries of policies in the past. And so early in the kind of period of time in which the United States was recognizing climate change as a profound, you know, challenge and a challenge that needed a government response to organize, right, private sector responses. Early in that period, and I would say that period goes back at this point really 30 years, right? That it was around 1989, 1990, when climate change became a recognized problem in the American political space. And so over right early in that period, you had some business groups, some labor groups who were quite interested in engaging in political conversations about how we address this problem. And there was a lot of policy activity, right, in many different spaces that engaged fossil fuel companies, engaged, you know, major manufacturers, and again, engaged unions as well. But when actions started to become a real possibility, and especially in 2009, when you had the Waxman-Markey cap and trade legislation that made it through the House, got stalled in the Senate, when that federal action became a real possibility, the reality of costs started to have political force, right? The reality of costs became evident to business groups, to labor unions. They got politically framed by very concerted, well-funded, strategic political actors who wanted to draw attention to those costs and wanted to resist policy activity, often not even for economic reasons so much as for ideological reasons. And this also intersected with the period of time where partisan polarization became just this enormously powerful force in American politics. And so you had the Tea Party emerging, and the Tea Party really sort of starting to pull Republican activity in a particular direction, making it more difficult for moderate Republicans to maintain their seats, right? Challenging Republicans who were engaged in this sort of policy space, challenging them in the primaries, right, and making it difficult for these political actors to continue working on climate change. And so there was this, right, we look now back and we say, oh, partisan polarization. We look back and we say partisan polarization is everything, but that's really emerged most strongly over the last decade. Prior to that, partisanship played a role, but climate wasn't a strictly partisan issue, right? And we can look back, right? And there are Democrats, right? Joe Manchin is the one, a Democrat from West Virginia, is the one who was shooting the climate bill, right, in his political advertising, right? So it wasn't a strictly partisan issue. But what's really important here is how political institutions intersect with this space, right? Because we have political institutions in the Senate, in the sort of current shape of the Electoral College, and the way we organize politics, and that overrepresents the minority interests who will be hurt, right, in the distributive politics game of climate action. And so all of these pieces, right, kind of came together to stall the Waxman-Markey bill, but then also really subsequently stall any kind of legislative action in an important way in climate policy. As we start thinking about, like, what's the future of climate policy, we might say, well, look at public opinion, right? Public opinion is changing. There's been a really striking change in public opinion over the last 2 years, where you see larger and larger portions of the American public who are taking climate change seriously, who think it has sort of, personal effects in their own lives, who want to see federal action. But that public support for climate policy is pretty soft, is how we would talk about it, right? So you can get majorities, and in some cases pretty large majorities, saying that the federal government should do more, that we should offer, tax credits and incentives, that we should have tougher restrictions on emissions. But as soon as you start asking questions that really push the public and say, how much are you willing to pay per month, right, in higher electricity bills to have, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, that public support diminishes really, really fast. And so we're not going to see policy action that comes from some kind of, mass demand for change on climate change, like we saw in the early 1970s, when you saw this huge public movement rise up, right, to address air pollution, water pollution, toxic contamination. You're not going to see that kind of mass organization on this issue. And you're going to continue to see these sort of minority interests that would get hurt by serious climate policy organizing against it. But just because you're not going to see sort of mass demand, it doesn't mean there won't be anything. And in fact, political parties, which we tend to point to as the stopping point, right, for climate policy in lots of ways, political parties can actually be sort of enablers for climate policy. And we're starting to see party politics in the Democratic Party move toward taking climate action seriously. And climate change, partly as a result of the Sunrise Movement, partly as a result of kind of interest group politics on the left, you're starting to see the Democratic Party sort of elevate climate change on its own agenda. And that's intersecting with a moment where you have a political candidate, a presidential candidate, who has pretty good relationships with labor groups, which has been kind of a forestalling climate action in the past. And so I'm happy to get into some of the details and questions about what that might look like sort of in the short term and the longer term. But I wanted to set the stage for how we got here, because it's not right? The rollbacks of the last few years are profoundly outside the scope of what the public supports, right? You know, they're far outside what the mass public wants with respect to climate policy right now, but they're not the only thing that's stalling climate action, right? There's this longer trajectory of slow movement on this issue that has to do with, right, really these sort of distributive politics about where things where costs come into play, and the challenge comes in moving from sort of a vision of climate policy to the mechanics of policy. And we saw that back with Waxman-Markey a decade ago, and we saw it more recently with the Americans with Care Act, right? Where a policy that has really broad public support in the abstract, once it gets labeled with a politician's name, becomes a target for political opponents. I think I'll wrap up there. Drew, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Megan. Gave us a lot to think about and to look for in the future, and we'll be asking questions later. I want to now introduce you to our next speaker, and this is Drew Shindell, and certainly a gift to the Nicholas School of the Environment and the faculty and staff there. He is a distinguished professor in earth science, and however, he's also worked as a NASA scientist at the Goddard Institute in New York, and he taught at Columbia University. His background, he received his BA from UC Berkeley and PhD from Stony Brook in physics. He's authored over 250 publications. He's a fellow in the AAAS, and Drew has had a chance, you heard Megan talk about Congress. Drew's had a chance to testify before Congress, being invited by both parties. And I'm sure he'll share some of that with us as well. He currently chairs the Scientific Advisory Panel on Climate and Clean Air Coalition. So Drew, welcome.
Thank you, Mamie. Appreciate everyone inviting me and everybody who's tuned in to listen. So, as you just heard, I trained as a physicist and therefore tend to be very quantitative and old-fashioned and have slides. So you're going to get the kind of full breadth of the Nicholas School here with people that have different styles and look at different contexts. So I'm going to try to share my screen with you. And there, hopefully that works. Somebody let me know if you can't see it, but I'm going to otherwise assume you can. So,
That's good.
All right. Oh, great. Thanks, Mamie. So what I wanted to talk about today was something that relates a little bit to, the general context of a policy that Megan has been setting for us. And I tend to think of one of the problems of getting action on climate change is distribution of impacts, but in a different way than Megan was just talking about. I'm thinking of who is affected and the distribution in time of when we take action versus when we reap any benefits from it, rather than say different winners and losers within the economy so much. So hopefully this will complement what we've just heard. I'm going to talk about some of the research that we've been doing in my group, and particularly trying to bring home to people how climate change impacts them personally. And so you see I have my person sweltering in the heat there on the left, and I have my person being stuck with breathing in polluted air on the right. And I had to change my background picture there for that one. Make sure there were good clouds of smoke in the back. Otherwise, now it just looks like somebody wearing a mask for COVID. So now this is somebody who's wearing a mask for air pollution, right? The pre-2000 situation. And I just wanted to point out also that the bulk of this work is really done by a great team of students, Duke students here there's 2 PhD students on that list, 1 master's and 3 undergrads. And And they are just really terrific. And I've been so pleased with the undergrads who are all volunteers and just come and they want to do something. So I really appreciate their work as well as some of my colleagues from my NASA days. And I wanted to start out by just my way of putting some of the changes in context. This is from the IPCC report we released a couple years ago, and really gives an idea of the pace of change that's needed and how dramatic and drastically even we need to change our use of energy within this decade. And so all I really wanted to draw your attention to here is that in order to reach kind of temperature targets that we were working on in this report, 1.5 degrees, which is what the nations of the world said they would aim for under the Paris Agreement. We didn't necessarily commit to getting there, but this was the aspiration. You really have to phase out the majority of the world's coal-fired power within this decade, right? So we're down something like 75% by the end of this decade, which probably means that advanced countries like the US have essentially gotten rid of coal entirely. And this is, again, global. We have the majority of our power, now maybe somewhere between half and 2/3, coming from renewables, again, by the end of this decade. And so, you can talk about partisanship and different lobbies and interests, and all of this stuff is extremely relevant. But from the physical point of view, since coal is the dirtiest fuel, it's got to go, right? If you do not phase out the bulk of coal by the end of this decade, you would have to, say, reduce gas by over 100%, just something totally, inconceivable. So these are the kind of conclusions you get from a purely physical analysis. We have to get rid of coal, and essentially that's the most dramatic, but phase out all of the fossil fuels and switch dramatically to renewables. And we have to do it right away. When we look at how much that might cost, you can put a price on carbon, and this is again from the IPCC report. And the faster you make the changes and the deeper you aim to cut and the lower temperature you want to achieve, the higher the price is. So don't worry about all the details here, but the point is these couple here are for temperatures that are trajectories that maybe just miss the 1.5 degree target, but then come back to it. So they overshoot, but come back. And then over here on the right are 2 degree scenarios. So, if you want to keep below 2, then you might need a price on the order of, say, $40 a ton in carbon. If you're willing to go well above and come back. If you want to keep below 2 without going over, maybe $80 a ton. And if you want 1.5, maybe $120 a ton, right? So there are real costs that need to be put into place. Otherwise, you can't motivate such a rapid transition. This is one of the things that I find most difficult to convey sometimes. So I've adapted this one a little bit from the from the last IPCC assessment. And the colors, don't worry about the details, but the point is I've listed here the temperature that we get to by the end of the century under different scenarios of more or less ambitious in our carbon reductions. And so the red is least ambitious, and we go to the more ambitious. And the point that I wanted to convey here is that we're asking people to make this huge change right away because the system is very slow. If you don't change right away, it's too late. But what you get from it is not really very much in the near term, right? This is our 2 degree scenario, and this is a 3 degree scenario, and you can't even tell the difference in 2040. And even by 2050, you can barely see any change, and you really start to see a difference between the worst case. But you're asking people to make this huge change in the structure of our energy system. Do it right now. Oh, and then by the way, you won't notice anything useful happening for 30 years, right? It's a really hard thing to be asking people. And so that's one of the reasons that in my group, we try to study other ways that might convey the benefits of taking action and convey that essentially, that if you think back to my first picture there, the person sweltering under the heat and the person suffering from air pollution, they're suffering from the same things, which is to say that our burning of fossil fuels in our motor vehicles, in our industry, in our power plant is the driver of both air pollution and climate. So one of the things we try to do is look at the impact of climate policies, but not only look at their effect on climate, but look at a broader suite of impacts. And so we look at, in particular, human health impacts. People obviously care about their health, both from air pollution and heat, all driven by the same activities. The impacts on labor productivity and the impacts on agriculture. And I'm not going to talk much about agriculture, but I will show you just a couple, hopefully, illustrative or thought-provoking results based on health and labor. And so one of these is, here's one of our conclusions about health effects. And the thing is, again, these bottom two are showing the difference between kind of our current trajectory, where we keep using a lot of fuels, fossil fuels around the world, versus one where we really cut aggressively to meet either, in this case, a 1.5 or 2-degree target, both consistent with, say, the Paris Climate Agreement. And as I mentioned before, for the first several decades, you see hardly any impact, right? These are for the sake of our international policies. We often translate these into dollars, but this is proportional to multiply by about 10, and that's the number of Americans that are dying every year. This is the impacts in America. So maybe by 2070, it's maybe 10,000 fewer people die from exposure to extreme heat. But within the next 30 years, you see almost no benefit. And by the end of the century, the benefits from reduced climate change are really dramatic for heat. But if you look at the near term, what you really see responding right away is air pollution. I mean, we've all seen this with the COVID shutdowns, right? Around the world, we shut down vehicles and we shut down power and industry. And what happened to the climate? Well, nothing. But what happened to air pollution? Well, the skies got blue in China and India and places that hadn't been, right? Air pollution responds really quickly. And so that's what's really illustrated here, that although these policies are designed for the sake of climate change, without even trying, they impact our health and well-being much more powerfully in the near term by affecting air pollution. And what we've been trying to do is create state-level information to support outreach on this. And I didn't really trust my ability to get this website to work. So this is a website we've created, which has all of our data on it. Again, this is my Duke students who are mostly double majors in environmental science and computer science, so they know how to make all this kind of stuff. They're great. And I took a little video of me using this. And what you can do here, let's see if this works. There we go. So I go and I click on the scenario, and I can look at the one I want. I can look at the year I want, and I can look at the impact that's of most interest to me, right? So in this case, I'm showing how many people die from exposure to ozone. And if we decarbonize, wow, 8,000 fewer in California. And then on the right, 8,000 fewer from particles. In Florida, however, right, it's a different story. And we get far more of our benefit from ozone than from particles. In New York, it's the other way around, because we've got lots of vehicles driving right where people live in the cities, right? So it really depends on the quantity you're looking at and the region you live, what might be most important. Now, if I switch this to heat, right, you can see that heat is starting to catch up this is 2070 now, but in, say, California, there's still far more impact, even late on in the century, from air pollution. But in somewhere like Minnesota, actually heat is more important, right? Minnesota is very clean air, and people in hot climates are not so good at dealing with heat. So the geographic pattern is different. I'm going to show you one more here, which is work lost days across all industries due to air pollution on the left, and now work lost days due to heat exposure on the right. And so again, we have very distinct spatial patterns. In New York, pollution really prevents a lot of people from working productively, but hardly ever is it too hot in New York for people to work. Whereas if you look at Texas, right, you still lose hundreds of thousands of work hours, but you lose millions due to heat exposure. And so again, depending on where you are and what's of most interest to you, you might find that the benefits of climate mitigation directly, which was your intended target, are the most important, or you might find that benefits of air pollution are more important. And that might change over time. And the idea is hopefully this can allow you to build a coalition of winners right, under mitigation policies to deal with kind of some of the things Megan was talking about, the special interests who are losers and don't want to make this change, right? Certain businesses are going to come out behind, but this is showing, for example, in Texas, 2 million lost work hours, right? And that's mostly the construction industry, that's trucking, that's manufacturing, that's agriculture, that's people who work outside. And so they should be natural allies in pushing for action. And what we've done with this kind of data, as I mentioned, we make this public. And as Mamie said in the introduction, I was asked to testify about this in Congress, which I did over the summer. And Congress is now producing a series of reports at the state level to really try to bring home these congressional delegations can go to their district and say, here's a report about what happens in my state. Here's an example in California, right? How much loss there could be to the economic system in California and how many people could die, right? It doesn't even mention the impacts on temperature. It doesn't say like, oh, 1/10 of a degree, which is hard for anybody to relate to. Here's they released a report for New York State that had some nice coverage on this too. It's the House Oversight Committee and places like Florida, right? Are really trying to talk about how we really get these massive benefits. Thus far, unfortunately, it was mentioned in the introduction, I've been asked by the Republicans to testify. The current congressional group of Republicans has not shown any interest in these, but it is public for whoever wants. So we've got a bunch of reports. We're trying to make this outreach and show how people in individual locations, something psychologically people can relate to, how they would benefit. And this bad news is that climate action doesn't yield very much in the near term. Because from climate, it just takes so long. The system is slow. It takes a long time to transform energy systems. It takes a long time for the physical system to respond. All of this is slow, and yet we want people to act now. So the good news is most of the benefits that we get in terms of things that we really care about, like our health and the economy and our worker productivity and such, these come about from air pollution, and so they come about very quickly. They also are a function of our own actions, right? We get all those air pollution benefits when the US decarbonizes, even if the rest of the world doesn't go along, right? The rest of the world has to go along if we want to reduce climate change, but they don't have to go along if we just want to clean up our air. And we can really put prices and number of people's affected. We have things like the number of children that get asthma, things that really people in leadership positions can take home. So I am looking forward to having questions and comments about all that, but I just wanted to introduce that's the kind of stuff we're working on as a way to try to bridge and with providing, a bunch of physical science information, but providing that in a way that we hope can help bridge some of the gaps in current ambition. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Drew, for sharing the good and the bad news. We appreciate that. I'm going to turn it over to Dory. Dory, you'll start with the questions. Yes.
Megan and Drew, I think this is for both of you on the different levels that you've helped us with tonight. Are the current policies reversible? And with the current policies, is there any permanent damage that's being done? And what are you guys seeing there?
Yeah, I don't know if you have, okay, I'll, a particular order here. So maybe it's to start with the second one. The problem with carbon, with CO2, is it piles up in the atmosphere and a good chunk of it lasts almost permanently on human timescales. And so if we say roll back vehicle standards and we have poorer, less efficient vehicles for another decade, and then eventually, we come around and follow what the rest of the world is doing, that carbon that was emitted in that decade will still be there causing problems, a century from now. So some of these things are not, the policy may be reversible, but the damage that's done is not reversible. And then of course, all the people that breathe in the pollution from the motor vehicles and such, that's a function of how efficient they are too. And if they're burning less fuel because they have better miles per gallon, there'd be fewer people walking down the streets of Manhattan or Charlotte or somewhere right near traffic and breathing all that stuff in. So all the people whose lives are affected and get heart attacks or respiratory disease from air pollution, that's not reversible either.
Okay.
My response would be the same. And then to take the next step and say, right, at some point for US emissions to decline, we need more aggressive public policies, right? We've seen, right, a large scale energy transition happen through primarily private market forces, right, and technological innovation. The New York Times had a wonderful visual today showing how the composition of our electricity grids, right, has really changed quite dramatically over the last couple of decades. But that, won't do enough, right? And Drew's presentation made that quite clear. And so there'll need to be more aggressive policy action if we want to make a bigger dent in these climate impacts. And situating that in sort of your question, Dory, about what's reversible, right? There's a bunch of recent policy actions that kind of, that stepped back from actions that the Obama administration took in its second term. But as long as you're doing all of this through executive action, then it's going to bounce back and forth, right, as the presidency changes hands, and is going to be very fragile for court scrutiny. And so it really takes legislative action to have a little bit more permanence and force, especially given how far apart the two parties are in the United States on this issue and how close the competition is between them.
Okay, thank you, Megan and Drew. Remind everybody again, submit your questions via chat. If you'd like to ask your question live, just raise your hand and we'll call you out. We do have a question from Max Holmes. I like the idea of trying to motivate client action based on the near-term health benefits as opposed to longer-term climate benefits. Does the current situation with COVID give you pause as to the efficacy of this approach? That is, we can't even get people to wear masks to save lives a few weeks from now.
Yeah, thank you, Max. That's an excellent question. And I saw this great comic of somebody, I guess they were supposed to be an infectious disease expert, and saying like, let's just show people what all the data says, and it'll solve everybody. Everybody will wear masks and do what we say. And there's two climate scientists in the background laughing like, no, they won't, right? So I guess I see both pros and cons in the example of the current case. I mean, I think a lot of people are getting more familiar with things like probabilities and the power of scientific evidence to provide useful information to people. And that's one of the troubles that you always have with something like air pollution or heat exposure is, especially with air pollution, it doesn't show up on anybody's death certificate. Oh, this person died because he breathed a bunch of fumes, and if only we had better cars, right? It just shows up, they had a heart attack, or they had, respiratory failure or lung cancer. So it's tough for people to make the statistical link. And I think people are getting a little bit more of a sense of, probabilities and flattening curves and how disease affects the population as a whole. I think you're right that and I mean, the other side is that people see how quickly we can improve air quality, and people see that there's a fair bit of evidence. It's still, a little bit shaky that air pollution and COVID interact. So I could see where there's some push that people might say, wow, now that we're really stressed out about this pandemic, that's an extra reason to deal with air pollution. But I would agree with you that you're right. On the other hand, you know, if we can't get people to do something that's as straightforward as wear a mask, and you're, you know, the virus is going right in and out of your own mouth, then we do face an uphill battle telling people that, you know, when you turn on your car and you turn that key and the engine kicks over and pollution goes out the back, well, some people, statistically, somebody's going to die if you drive that all year. That's like, wow. That's a harder one to relate to than a mask. So how to get past that, I think, is still an excellent question. Well, I will count on my social science colleagues to help out.
And I think an important difference is, right, COVID requires all of us to do the right thing individually, right? It requires this individual action. And really tackling climate change in an important way can't be done through individual choices, right? It can't be done by all of us changing our light bulbs for LEDs. It's going to require the force of public policy to propel action, right? To provide large incentives, to, you know, create important regulatory constraints. And so that means you don't have to persuade everyone. You know, what the work that Drew and his team are doing, that might help the mass public to understand a little bit better, you know, the more immediate payoffs. But more critically, in my opinion, is that it can help decision makers to take tough decisions, right? It can help the people who are responsible for state budgets, the people who are, you know, voting on reconciliation bills and hearing from interests that are going to have to pay a price. It gives them some confidence that there are payoffs from a tough vote that could accrue in the shorter term than the, you know, 50-year out that they hear about, you know, that they've always heard about with respect to kind of climate change benefits and temperature benefits. And so it's not necessarily, you know, when I look at Drew's work, I'm skeptical about the degree to which you can move public opinion with work like that and the force of moving public opinion on this issue. I'm more optimistic that kind of work can move decision makers, right? Can move votes in legislatures, can move executives and folks in agencies to take tough actions.
So I have a question. I know there's one from Jack too, but I'll ask one regarding your future research or your current research, because I really like hearing you saying that this should be tied to human health and you know, even the food sources in agricultural, because that's an opportunity to get people of color engaged when you start talking about human health issues and asthma in those communities. So if we're talking about engagement and getting folks, you know, really wanting to do more and in broadening our coalitions, we need to be thinking along those lines. So my question is, are we doing any academic research or thinking about any research, potential policies or legislative efforts that will address these issues, your research with the equity lens on it? Is that something you guys have been thinking about or have done in this arena?
Yeah, so that's actually very interesting that you asked right now, because I feel like I've spent by now, I have to confess, decades, you know, working on climate with hardly ever thinking of this issue, and it seems like it's really become something that's the whole community is thinking about now. And so when you used to get information from medical studies, they would say, oh, this is the effect on the average population. And so all I could do is say, okay, well, now I can look at the effect, the average response, without any distributional impact. And I would say that community has changed. And I see a change now in our incoming students. And so I had not thought of it at all before, but now I am, largely because some of the students that have joined my group have said, you know what I'm really interested in is not just how many people, say, in North Carolina are affected, but which people, and can we really tease that out? So yeah, I think that's where we're starting to move. And of course, we've long known that lower socioeconomic status leads to, generally worse health outcomes, right? That's sort of true for most everything, but especially things like air pollution. So I think, I think we're going to do a lot with that over the next years. I hope so, anyway.
Yeah, I think that's important as we look at this infrastructure when we're talking about moving and expanding and increasing that, looking where we put our highways and, all of those, communities that got them in the 60s and 70s. We hope we'll see something different this time around. So I'm going to give it back to either Jim or to Dory for another question.
Okay, thank you. Questions are starting to roll in now. We have one from Jack Kavanaugh. Presumably, there are several states that benefit from jobs associated with fossil fuels. Is it possible to displace those jobs with renewable related jobs in the same locations? For example, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Dakotas, Texas. Is part of the political inertia economic job related?
It's hard to make one-for-one trades, right, in terms of geography in that area. And absolutely, in answer to the latter part of the question, is part of what's going on jobs related? Absolutely, it's jobs related. And it is, people whose communities have been tied to industries, and whose employment histories and potentially their families' employment histories have been tied to industries, and it takes on a form of identity, political identity, community identity, and that identity doesn't easily just switch to a different form of energy sector employment. And it also, right, in practice, how these policies take hold, we can't, that's part of my story about the winners aren't, there's some uncertainty, right, about how the policies take hold and where particular projects get cited and how promises, right, of job training programs and promises of economic transition, how those promises get delivered down the road, right? It's hard to tell communities in Western Pennsylvania, right, that there's going to be some kind of one-for-one job guarantee, right? It doesn't work that way. And so that raises the uncertainty. And then you have, right, like concentrated interests who come in with money who are ready to take advantage of that uncertainty, right? And ready to organize people's opposition that's grounded, right, in their own personal experience. And then it can easily be mobilized by political messages. So it is part of the story, and we can try to design policies that help to buffer that, but there's no guarantees, right? The way those policies take hold. I always talk about, ultimately a clean energy transformation requires lots and lots of renewables projects, right, that are going to need to be installed throughout the country. And at the local level, we get opposition to renewables projects, right? We get environmentalists in many cases, right, coming up and saying, we oppose, right, this new wind installation, or don't put solar panels in the desert, what have you. I can blame environmentalists, I can blame NIMBYs, I can blame whoever. when you're designing large scale, multi-trillion-dollar national policy, you can't guarantee how that's going to play out at the local level with project level installations, right? So there's uncertainty about how that will take hold. You can provide incentives and try to move it in the right direction, but once you have that uncertainty, then you're giving you're creating a political obstacle to action.
Yeah, if I could just add a quick comment, is that we have another professor here, Lincoln Pratson, who's done some work in this area, and the renewables tend to create about 5 times as many jobs in his analysis as are lost. But I think Megan had the point is that those people losing them are very organized. And so coal is a perfect example. You know, coal has become so mechanized that there just aren't very many jobs at all. I mean, switching away from coal, it's almost impossible to find anything that uses less manpower than coal industry, right? The tractors or the shovels that dig it out are, you know, 10 stories high, and that's one person operates this huge equipment. But the coal lobby is powerful. And so I think you don't have an evenly batched model in terms of political spending, which hinders making this argument effectively that even you're coming out ahead in jobs, but that lobby is not organized, the people that don't have them yet, and the people that are standing to lose, even if they have a small number of jobs, often have a lot of money.
And the jobs are tied to identity, right? There's a history around some of these industries. The histories are embedded in communities, and there are narratives about failed promises to those communities. There are narratives about lost power in the larger political sphere, and it's easy to take advantage of those narratives in the political space, so that people, right, whose families lost those jobs, generations before, or people whose families never were particularly tied to the industry, can still be mobilized by those narratives, even if the jobs are long gone in the way that Drew describes.
Okay, our next question is from Dave 24. Why is the public resistant to decarbonizing electric power generation based on increased electricity costs when electricity generated by renewables such as wind energy is now cheaper than coal generated power? My own experience is that the solar panels I installed on my roof in 2012 under a 20-year lease immediately resulted in a 25% decrease in my total electricity cost. Is the public perception of higher costs for renewable electricity based on outdated cost data?
Well, so my opinion on that is that in general, the bulk of the public is not as resistant to decarbonizing and likes the idea, and that it's much more the electric utility industry that's resistant, and they have a tradition of using power that they can dispatch at any time, and you turn up the little lever knob and you get more from coal or gas. And if the wind stops blowing, they don't want to be held accountable that, oh, we didn't manage the grid well enough and tie in storage and have long transmission lines. So they would prefer to keep doing things the way they've always done them because they know how to do them that way. And in many parts of the world, like North Carolina, for example, right, where Duke Energy operates, they have a very odd incentives where they, by legislature, by the law, they are not allowed to make money selling electricity, right? Because that would encourage them to be wasteful and have us all overconsume, and that's just bad. So the legislature gave them a monopoly power, many, many decades ago in exchange for connecting the grid and making sure they brought electrification everywhere. And they make money by building capital equipment. And so if you put solar panels on your roof, you are eating into their profits, and they say, oh, you're going to mess up the grid. because we want to be in control of it and not have you putting stuff in there. And they have an incentive to build more fossil fuel powered power plants, because every time they build one, that's how their profits come in. They're guaranteed a rate of return based on their capital spending. So they do not have an incentive. It sounds strange, but they do not have incentive to sell us cheaper power. They make no money by doing that. Whereas out west, where you have many deregulated markets and utilities are putting out a bid and they say, you know, we want 100 megawatts, who's going to give us the cheapest offer? It's now, like you're pointing out in your question, it's almost invariably being won by renewables.
We have another question, just generically, and then we'll go back to the chat. Can both of you talk about the national security risk of climate change that we might be having?
It's significant. It's hard to label and quantify because it tends to be, you know, climate change is a background condition and an amplifier of things that are more proximate, right? So climate change can contribute to water scarcity, right? That then, right, the immediate conflict is over water distribution. Climate change can contribute to migration, right, which then becomes the sort of immediate spark of conflict, and so on. Certainly to poverty and disparities in economic development. And so, you know, there's a lot of research trying to name and quantify the extent to which climate change is driving conflict between states, between nations. And, you know, in typical academic fashion, you can get into lots of arguments about, you know, the best ways to identify and to measure these things. But in, you know, in practice, the US military was very early in recognizing climate change as an important phenomenon that was going to drive sort of the future of interstate relations and going to constrain, you know, our own US military activities. And so there's been a lot of work within our US military to recognize climate change and its security implications. That manifests in myriad ways, right? In lots of military planning, but also in, you know, the way that that military bases are engaging with their local communities, right? So along the Eastern Seaboard, Hampton Roads and Norfolk are held out as real leaders in preparing for the local, you know, stress of sea level rise and coastal storms, and ongoing flooding and displacement and, you know, people being put at public health risk because of sea level rise. And part of the reason Hampton Roads and Norfolk are leaders in sort of planning and moving forward on this challenge is because the Navy has been really involved with local communities in addressing this, because the Navy recognizes this as a real challenge, right, for its operations in that area. So it's sort of, you know, we're addressing it at the global scale down to the local scale. It often is happening in this sort of siloed way, right? That's not kind of intersecting with a lot of other activities around the federal government. And just again, from my political lens, we might think, oh, well, let's exploit this. Let's take the kind of security frame. Maybe that can drive public interest and maybe that can drive policymakers to really take this seriously. But once you start putting something in the security frame, you're changing the politics, right, around that issue. And you're changing expectations about transparency of decision making. You're changing expectations about sort of, democratic voice in decision making. We do a lot of military decision making through mechanisms that we might not be comfortable with if it were public health decision making. And so, are we comfortable putting climate into that space, right, where we remove some of the accountability that comes from more representative democratic processes?
Yeah, briefly to just chime in, if that's all right. I think Megan's touched on the main things that come to my mind: climate refugees and sea level rise and such. The other things that I think are interesting are that if you look at somewhere like the Arctic, that was the possibility of sending ships through there was limited just 2 decades ago to maybe a dozen days a year, and now there's been ice-free travel more than 100 days this year. It's just completely changed, and we have overlapping territorial claims of a bunch of countries. So it's anybody's guess, I think, what might happen up there. Depending on how well we get along with Russia, we're very close, obviously. And Russia is the one other point I'd make, is Russia is not alone in being one of the states that we don't necessarily get along with, that are troublesome, that are authoritarian rule, and are propped up by petrodollars. And Iran is the same. And Saudi Arabia, maybe we get along with better, but they're also authoritarian. And these states are all propped up by fossil fuel money. So there's a real implication, not only of climate change, but of decarbonization and really changing the power structure of some of these petrostates.
Thank you. Our next question from M. Gregory. The political polarization and adversarial nature of the discussion of climate change is connected to money, interests, and influence. Can forward-thinking companies, large and small, break the political stalemate and seesawing by stepping up to influence the government to move in a sustained way towards climate action?
I've seen some efforts, right? These bipartisan, efforts to especially pull in leaders from the business community to advocate for climate action, right? In the way that they were doing 20 years ago, right? But to bring back that kind of policy conversation. It is very, very difficult in the current political environment. I cannot overstate the degree to which partisan polarization has just shifted our politics in the United States, and shaped what's possible. And so I don't see that letting up soon, right? This is not a Trump phenomenon. This is something that's been going on and that has all kinds of positive feedbacks built in, where what's happening in the public is feeding what's happening among political leaders, and that's feeding back into the public. And it kind of reduces the space for that kind of like civic society, right? Business leaders coming together in a bipartisan way to really substantially influence political outcomes. I would say what could help, right, is if there does become some kind of major legislative effort, in the next few years, the extent to which it doesn't draw the force of money, right, and the force of strong business opposition would be helpful, right? It still will draw a lot of mass opposition. It still will draw a lot of ideological opposition. But if the business community doesn't come out and force against it, that helps, right? And so I don't see a space where that's going to be the leading light on policy change, but it might help make possible something that wouldn't be possible if you have the business community kind of in opposition.
Drew, anything to add? Okay, we have one more question here. This is from Alexandra Carton. Do you think environmental racism is being put on the same level of importance as the overall fight to decrease fossil fuels and combat climate change?
If the question is whether it's being put on the same level, getting the same level of attention from political leaders and the policy community, no, it is not. Environmental racism has become an important part of the conversation about climate change, and that's a real change, and an important change. And seeing that happening again within the structures of the Democratic Party is really interesting, right? Because that enables climate change, right, and environmental action to actually be elevated within the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party for quite a few decades now has taken civil rights quite seriously. And so if climate change becomes part of the conversation about racism, that helps enable, right, the party to take climate change seriously. And then, you know, from my perspective, from my sort of normative perspective, hopefully do things in ways that will be more attentive to the justice implications, right? You know, have justice be a critical part of policy design, and have you know, diverse voices and communities that are experiencing the concentrated costs of these facilities really be, you know, a driving part of designing solutions. I think that's good for the content of the solutions, but I think this new intersection honestly is politically, right, when you're thinking about winners and losers and who has influence, it's to the benefit of climate change to have this link with racism and inequality be part of the conversation, because it's bringing new constituencies to be thinking about this as a challenge.
Thank you, Megan. Drew, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just agree that I think that this is part of the overall way that, you know, it's climate change is often thought of by people as its own sort of unfortunately isolated issue. And, you know, oh, we have to do something about the climate for the polar bears in the rainforest or something. And the more we link it to the things that are really top priorities, I think that is to our benefit. And I think that's what we really, I mean, that's the kind of thing we're seeing more and more. And it's come up in the questions, you know, it's actually cheaper to use renewables, right? You pay less for energy. You actually get more jobs, even though admittedly you lose some in certain sectors. And you improve inequality because both the damages from climate change itself and from air pollution disproportionately affect low socioeconomic status and minorities. And so I think the more we can kind of change the climate story as being a story that's really about all these day-to-day issues that we care about, and climate is kind of an underlying unifying theme, but not the central one, that's just helpful. But it's taking, I think Megan's right, it's just starting much more, and it's still, it's a slow process. It's not at the same level yet.
And I want to just jump on something that Drew just said, and it's reaching beyond the question. I became really interested in, you know, why was climate change even tagged as an environmental issue, right? It could have been a national security issue. It could have been an energy policy issue. It could have been many other kinds of issues, right? Why did we bundle it with environment when it appeared on the political agenda? And there's some really interesting history around that. But one thing some co-authors and I have recently been looking at is actually just media coverage, and we use search terms and see, over time, what percentage of media articles about the environment mentioned climate change, and what percentage of media articles about global warming or greenhouse effect or climate change mentioned environment. And you see really dramatic change over time. So early, right? If you go back 25 years, early, the climate change or global warming or greenhouse effect stories, they all mentioned environment, and very few environment stories mentioned climate change. Now, a really high proportion of environment stories mention climate change, but a much smaller proportion of climate change stories are talking about the environment, because they're often talking about national security, or they're often talking about, right, the other dimensions of this issue, that it's not just sort of an environmental issue that the Sierra Club and NRDC are going to be, concerned with, but in fact, this is an economy-wide, a society-wide problem, and you see that reflected in media coverage of the issue.
Great thoughts, Megan. That's very interesting. We're nearing the end of our Q&A discussion period. Katie, do we have time for one more quick one?
I think so, yes.
Okay. This is my standard wrap-up question here. Megan and Drew, if you were king and queen of the world for a day, what top 3 things would you do to put us on the right path to getting where we need to be with climate change?
Drew, you first.
King for a day, huh? Couldn't I have like a whole year at least? This is too bad. 4 years, that's what I want. 4 years. Sorry. So I guess I would the things I would do, I would say, number one, we're turning off all coal-fired power plants in this country. I'm just thinking nationally here, king of the U.S. All coal-fired power plants within, say, 3 years. Number two, we're not building any more fossil fuel powered infrastructure. And that's really, that's one of the things that I just find so frustrating. It's like that old, adage, if you're in a hole, stop digging. We're in a hole and we keep building more. And who's going to build a brand new, $10 billion gas-fired power plant and then say, oh yeah, by the way, we really believe in low carbon, we'll shut it off in a few years. Of course they're not, right? So don't build any more. And then we can start to, once we're not making the hole any worse, then we can start getting rid of fossil fuels, which I advocate what most economists believe is the most efficient way, is put a price on carbon. So as king, I would do that. And then everything else would just naturally fall out. But yeah, those would be my first moves.
So I live in the land of political constraint, and so I can't even really fathom the question, because I go to, a carbon price, that's bad politics. But if I'm queen, then I guess I don't have to worry about bad politics. Shutting down coal is for sure, number one. But what I would add to Drew's list is an expensive and comprehensive subsidy program to help communities grapple with the effects that are coming regardless. We have, most of my work is actually at the local level in the United States, and we have enormous disparities between communities in their capacities to absorb the consequences of climate change that are unfolding and will unfold at a faster and faster rate. And so we have, community water systems that cannot continue to deliver water when they are experiencing drought. We have, coastal communities and riverine communities that cannot recover in a consequential way when they are experiencing repeat flooding. And there are enormous disparities, and those are going to become more and more exaggerated. And I think that we really need to take that seriously, because even if we shut down the coal-fired power plants tomorrow, that's happening, and it's going to continue happening. And you know, some communities can absorb it and be resilient, but many simply cannot with our current inequalities in funding and our racial and economic inequalities. So that would be my number 3 or 4 to add to Drew's list.
Well, thank you all for great discussion and great questions. Thank you from the audience for your questions. And Mamie, back to you for the big finish.
Thank you so much. Again, I want to say thank you to King Andrew, or Drew, I guess, as well as Queen Megan. Those names sound pretty, they're comfortable coming off of my tongue there. We appreciate all that you've done and shared with us tonight. More importantly, what you're doing to invest in our future and in our students at Duke. We had some aha moments for sure. One being around changing and looking at our stories and our narratives and how important those are in terms of people getting motivated and excited about this. Again, to our audience, we thank you so much for your time. And I take a personal privilege to say I had 7 people that showed up from my group, and 2 of which are students that are shadowing me from another university. And so Alexandra asked a question early, and Bailey Bosman is also on the line. So we thank you, students, for taking the time out of your schedule. We want to particularly say thank you to the staff, the faculty and staff at Duke, the staff in particular, because they were the ones that helped us get organized and helped us put together this great program. And I'm really, really grateful for Kevin McCarthy. What a great guy. He has been there for us. He's very, very patient, but very, very receptive to some of our bold ideas. And we are appreciative of you, Kevin, for being there, and the entire ODAR staff for your assistance in helping us finalize this. So again, thank you very much. And we look forward to interacting with you all on other occasions. So good night. For me. Kevin, would you like to greet the audience?
I think we're losing them, but thank you. I have the real players here, and the people who would actually hang out and listen to me. But I am delighted you stayed so long with us this evening. Drew and Megan, it was a pleasure listening to you. I learned something all the time when I listened to both of you. And I just want to invite everyone that's on this call tonight. We invite your support of the Nicholas School. We invite your further engagement. All the things that you heard of tonight, and all of the teaching and research, it happens because people invest in us. So if you'd like to know more, or simply you'd like to get on our mailing list, just let Katie O'Grady know, or me know, and we can certainly make sure that you get our Environment magazine, or perhaps even the Dean's Weekly Update. We can send you that, and that gets you a little more closer to the inner workings of the school and things that we're concerned about. So thanks again for joining us. If you'd like more info, just let us know. You can reach us. Our emails are on our website at the Nicholas School, and we'd be delighted to talk to you about how you can help the Nicholas School, or just keep in touch. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Good
Thanks,
night.
everyone.
Guys.
Bye-bye.
Night,
Good
everyone.
night.
Good night, everybody. Be safe.
Yeah.
Night.